of 130 companies that have basically already did our job. So we developed standards and guidelines for interactive television. I am now involved in virtual reality projects and cryptocurrency projects. First of all, I want to thank Victor and Digital Hollywood for putting this together and for you being here. So thank you all. We're here with our esteemed panel and of experts and visionaries. How is that? Is that like, that's on your business card, right? It should be. We always do these things, and our joke is that Victor really only has 4 panels, and he just finds 75 ways to creatively describe them. So, you notice that? You notice that? So anyway, we are going to talk about, it says visionary. What do you know that? It says deep dive, creative, visionary, experiential content, and technology. But like every other panel here, we're going to talk about VR, AR, and sort of, oh, he's here. Yay. Woo. That's right. Hey, okay, cool. All right. So it's BJ, right? It is. BJ's here. BJ's in the house.
Apologies to all.
All right. No, this is good. Good time. All right. So this is easy. The first part, I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the company. No commercials. Okay? All right. Go ahead. You're first.
Great.
Edward.
I'm Edward Button. I'm a cinematographer and director, as well as I produce a little bit. Currently, I'm wrapping up a residency at Technicolor New York, where I was working on some game engine projects with a couple of artists. My sort of claim to be here is I was a director of photography on Doug Liman's series Invisible, as well as I've shot a bunch of projects with The Mill and a couple music videos, different projects like that. I come out of being I'm a freelancer, essentially. I come out of being a union cinematographer, and then I went a couple years ago and got a Media Lab degree. So I landed right into sort of DK1 when that came out and playing around and teaching myself to write code and all of that stuff. And it's been really exciting.
Cool. Cool. Bastian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bastian Den Braber. I'm a co-founder, president, CEO of Samo VR. You may have heard of us. Last year, we created Eden Drugs VR experience, which has like 2.5 million views now for an artist who had 80,000 fans on Facebook. Won 3 accolades for that as best VR music experience last year. What we do is we focus on emerging tech strategy for the music industry. So AI, AR, VR, and all of that combined. So we developed like 12 months. We developed like 12 months emerging tech strategies for the music industry, help them throughout the production. We do the distribution, and we help make sure that everything is monetizable so that the overall campaign has a positive ROI.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Goldstein. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an indie content studio called Otherworld Interactive. We're kind of, I would say, most known for a piece called Sisters, which is kind of like a haunted house experience. If you haven't tried it, scare yourself, your friends. We have content on 7 different head-mounted displays, and doing this over the past 3 years, I've worked on or done about a dozen or more different VR pieces, mostly in game engines, including IP for the Blair Witch Project, and have done some really cool educational pieces, one with Mattel and Smithsonian. So I have a lot of background in making digital content as well as adapting IPs to virtual reality.
Great. Okay, BJ.
Hey, my name is BJ Schwartz, and I'm the co-founder of Vanishing Point Media. And my partner Annie and I are filmmakers by background, and we got more and more involved in the 360 space. And we've been doing a lot of advertising for companies from Banana Republic to doing recently the Be a Guest on Jimmy Kimmel ad piece for, virtual reality tie-in for the Jimmy Kimmel Live experience. So I guess where you'll see a lot of digital content, we're more on the video capture end of things, though we are now branching into software development as well.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to start this out. The way I like to do my panels is to sort of see if we can create a conversation. So the less I say, the better it is. So I want you guys to sort of listen to each other and feel free to react to each other's comments without me doing it. But I'll be watching, and periodically I'll pump in a question. And truthfully, this is an educational experience for me. I've been involved in technology, media for a long time. But VR is relatively, in terms of me being focused on it, I've only really been into it for about 9 months now, since I've been working with this company, Voxless. So this is very much, I'm the guy who left his phone off. Oops. How embarrassing. You asked for it. I know. Of course, it's my ex-wife.
Perfect.
This is part of the comedy day, too.
Right.
How do they always know when to go?
That's going to cost me. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Anyway, so I'm learning a lot from this stuff. So some of my questions are going to be fairly basic. Bear with me, but I think we're going to have some insightful answers. One of the big issues that we've been dealing with the company that I have is the viewer access to the content. And I'd like to start the conversation by getting an idea, because most of you are involved in content creation, right? And most of you are doing primarily 360 VR. Right now, are you focused more on gamers? Are you making some attempt to have the broader scope? Because in terms of developing content, the experience on a Samsung VR is a different experience on a Vive or an Oculus or Sony. How much of what you're doing is focused on sort of the higher end gaming stuff, and how much is more accessible to like Google Daydream if you're working on that platform, and more accessibility to a larger audience. So Edward, tell me what you think about this.
So I heard something interesting about 3 years ago, and this is what headed me down this route. I was taking a course to learn Unity, and I heard it was about experimental gaming. So I heard something really interesting, a stat that supposedly, and this isn't a proofed out stat, but supposedly about 10% of people who play first-person shooters don't actually play the game. They like walk around and check out the scenery and this whole area, all these things. Like, Assassin's Creed is beautiful. So this got me really interested, because I remember a bunch of years ago when Iron Man came out, and everyone was like, Hollywood is saved. It did $300 million in the opening weekend. And that same weekend, Grand Theft Auto opened up to $550 million. And I thought to myself, hey, 10% of those people aren't playing. That's $55 million for the experience, just to walk around and check out the production design and the bar and the cars. So I think that's a split question. I'm looking at, in my work, and I think that we're not necessarily going after gamers, but people that play games are apt to understand this and apt to really be really good adopters. So it's sort of gamers, but not more people into the art of it. Mm-hmm. As well as then a lot of what I've done in the past has been very accessible in terms of like 360 video, because it's just what we're serving right now. I mean, there's only a couple 100,000 trackable headsets in the wild, right. And most of those I think are owned by people in this room, kind of thing. So we're preaching to the choir
right.
a little bit. So.
And the other thing is that most of them are mobile.
Yeah.
And so, everything that we do, and that we want to branch into doing more interactive stuff, but everything that we've done to date has been 360 video, and that has turned out to be quite a surprisingly rich field of play for VR, because I don't think that Oculus or Vive initially thought that people were going to be that interested in 360 video, and it turned out that perhaps it's partially the technology, the way it's been distributed, that people watch a lot of video.
Well, to clarify, that when you're saying 360 video, it doesn't necessarily have to have an interactive component.
Exactly. So there's and the advantage to that is, if you've ever seen a 360-degree video, the way that they're produced, it's all baked in. There's no rendering going on in the headset itself. It's just stretching an image over a map that you're then looking around as if you're inside the globe, as opposed to being outside the globe. And as a result, phones can handle this experience incredibly well. I actually would argue, and I think that there's a lot of discussion about is it true VR, if it's video, but what I would argue is that 360 video is always going to be a huge chunk of the reality of VR because people want, no matter what else they want to be in a room with a star, or they want to be in a place with a real person or in a real place. So as long as that's the case, I think there's always going to be a chunk of this industry that is going to be camera captured content. How it plays in, we'll find out.
All right, let me jump in here because yesterday I was working on like a market research report, just so some numbers so we can start to kind of talk about this mobile versus HMD conversation, which I think is a really cool and interesting point. So Gear VR has 5 million plus. Google probably has 25 million plus in terms of the HMD marketplace, which is Vive, PlayStation, and Oculus Rift. PlayStation is about 60% of that market and estimated to do even better. So it seems like in the HMD market, kind of PlayStation is winning, but that doesn't mean there isn't monetization on the other sides. The key kind of takeaway, I think, is if you look at it, is that VR is growing in so many different aspects. And if you look at the kind of HMD, you have a much smaller market, but that market is really made up of people who play video games, who are willing to spend $20, $30, $40 on a piece of content because they've already dropped $5 to $1,000 on having something to play for it. Now, mobile, you have a much larger audience, but you can't sell something for $20, $30, $40 on mobile. So, if you're an advertising company, you're going to mobile because you want to get more views and you want to get it out there. If you're a video game studio, well, obviously you're probably going to HMD because you're going to be able to monetize more and you're going to have video gamers actually play it. I think in terms of looking at those video gamers, one of the things that we ask ourselves internally at Otherworld a lot is why are people playing VR? It's really easy for you to answer the question of why do I have a cell phone? I have a cell phone because I need to call people, because I need maps, because I need all these different things. What is the answer to why do I need VR? And for people who play video games, that's really easy. But for other areas of VR, it's not so easy.
Yeah, thank you for laying the groundwork, guys, because it's, I think it plays in perfectly with how we look at the market, because it's quite clear, like you just laid out, what the market is like, and we know that gamers are the earlier adopters of mostly the interactive HMDs, the high-end HMDs, probably also the lower end. So that is a given, and it says something about your audience. Equally, we know that the volume of consumption is 360 videos on Facebooks and YouTubes, and that's also perfectly fine. So the way we look at the market, say, okay, we have these musicians, we focus on the tier 1 artists, so we're talking anything from 20, 50, to 100 million fans on each of the social media platforms. And when they release music, they don't like to be exclusive on individual platforms, so they want to reach their fans. They want to create epic content and make sure that their fans can actually consume it. So the answer for them is, generally, you need to be everywhere. But then you start dissecting it, and you start realizing, so which of these fans are on which platform, right? And you start using, okay, so what kind of content do we want to create for a specific platform to reach a specific fan for a specific kind of experience. And when you start dissecting it, you start looking at 360 teasers, Facebook, YouTube, 360 ads that can live with the New York Times. They have 360 video ads on the website, and more have that. Live streaming of VR from the concerts, behind the scenes, live or not live, stuff from the tour bus. So all these pieces of content that have their individual value that you have to figure out up front before you do anything, which platform is going to live on, what the purpose of the piece of content is, which fans you're going to reach with it, and how all of that interconnects, right? When are you going to drop certain pieces, and how is it going to lead to the next piece and the next piece? And not just AR, VR, but also how it fully integrates with everything else they're already doing, right? They're in a studio, they're launching singles, they're launching albums, and they're on a tour. And then there is usually this, what we call the valley of death after the tour, when they sort of usually take a break, and at some point the cycle starts all over again. So it's really about making sure this is really well understood, and then figuring out what kind of content you're going to create for which platform, when you're going to drop it, how you're going to produce it, getting all these kind of experts together to create each individual piece of content and bring it all back together and launching that over a period of 6 or 12 months' time.
Oh, okay. No, first of all, Thank you. That was great because you were all doing what I said, talking to each other. But I want to get, while we're talking about the viewer and the platform, I'm always interested in your partnership relationships. And whether they are now or the future partnerships in two areas. One in the distribution area, the technology distribution area, which would be, we've got the big players who are involved in VR AR, which is obviously Facebook and Oculus, Sony, Google, and then to a lesser degree, but also coming up is the HoloLens with Microsoft, and Apple, who is the big question mark. That's been a big issue to me because I've got a platform that we're trying to make as accessible as possible, and we're constantly running into, well, we're 100% Apple, and what can you do with that? So I'd like to find out first what your relationships are, or what your viewpoint is in dealing with the platforms that they're developing up and how important they are. So we're talking about like the big five players, the Facebook and Oculus 5, the whole thing. Okay, Edward.
Let's start with somebody else.
Huh?
Let's start with somebody else on that question.
Somebody else that should get that question.
Somebody want to jump in that first?
All right,
I mean,
go for it. Who wants that question?
I guess the first thing I'll say is many of those content partnerships, they don't really let you talk about them. So
What?
yeah, so they
Do I have to
can't.
get you guys drunk? What is this?
I guess what I will say.
I love that you assume we're not drunk, but go ahead.
What's in the water?
I know exactly right.
What I think I will say is that understanding the platforms and who is funding content for them is immensely important for content producers and what is going on now. Most of the work of many of the content studios is funded by a platform holder. But that also then entails what you're getting and how you build and create your company. So the investment panel, Rob Vickery had a really good kind of little piece about that. So if I go out and work exclusively with HTC Vive and they give me $250,000 to make a piece, I also have to know that there probably is going to be some exclusive window on HTC Vive, and I'm only addressing like 250,000 users. So my monetization on the back end for that content is going to be tiny. Whereas if I bootstrap, find an investor or even an angel, or let's say work with a company that holds the IP, I get generally less money up front to kind of make it because I'm trying to do it for as low as possible, but I should expect more back-end return. And a lot of the internal conversations that we have is really about what is the life cycle of a VR product. Just because this marketplace right now is so small, and I mean, it's much larger than it was a year ago, it's still tiny. So you have people who are out there with VR headsets who really are consuming content very quickly. And most of the content that's out there is very short as well. So you see people on PlayStation who are playing VR a lot and they've literally got through most of the games that are there. So you're at a point where if you put content up there, it's probably going to do okay. And instead of like movies or television, the life cycle of monetization I think is much, much longer.
Right. Yeah, and I think you mentioned a couple of things that are very relevant for us, and we're in a lucky position that everybody wants our content. So the conversation is generally relatively easy. We're completely agnostic in terms of distribution. For us, it's like we need to reach the audience, period. Which means at some point the content will live on every platform. There is often a question as soon as we incorporate some form of sponsoring from the platforms, obviously they want some window of exclusivity which they know is only temporary. And that will, for that exclusive window, it will exclude some others. But for instance, the top 3 would compete against each other basically, but they won't compete against the Facebook and the YouTube, because for those, we use that to reinforce people to drive traffic towards that higher end experience, right? Including all kind of 2D activities, activations at tours, or other events that the artists are performing, and other clever stuff that we build into this overall marketing campaign. So yeah, it's usually lives, and those partnerships are very critical, and interestingly enough, it worked both ways. They're so hungry for content that if you have good content, you have a relatively easy conversation. Having said that, they're also very critical because they all want that epic piece. So when we look at the music industry, I wish we could serve everybody. But the reality is that the demand side forces us to focus, let's say, on the top 1% because everybody wants those epic pieces.
And I want to push back on that too and be that guy because I don't think that's going to happen for an extremely long period of time. And the reason because of that is if you look at content that is out there, you might have a piece of VR content that's on Gear VR and it's also on HTC Vive, which means that it's got completely different controls, different mechanics, different ways of doing story, and it's obviously built for mobile and has been adapted over to the HMD, which makes it kind of a lesser experience. And as we get more and more content in this marketplace, I think users are going to differentiate between, stuff that is actually built for the HTC Vive and you can walk around in a room and have a great time, and stuff that is completely stationary.
Sure, yeah, no, but I see that as a build on because that's, when the very first conversations when you look at, okay, so who's the fan, who's the artist, what's the content they want to create, what's the message you want to get across, where are the fans? Usually, focus on creating that highest end experience and create derivatives of that for the different platforms, which, almost in all cases will include the Samsung platform sooner or later. But I think I said top 3 before, it's probably top 4 because Samsung plays in that field where they would be funding experiences and that would exclude some of the others that also have that window and that separates them from the Facebook and YouTubes.
I also think it's important to keep in mind that, we're 2 years away from a lot of these differentiations between the platforms being gone because everyone's going to come out with a standalone headset that's wireless. We just saw 2 companies announced, right, just a couple days ago. So, things move pretty fast. I think that we're going to be working, I'm working in 360 video and learning a lot about storytelling in that way, and there's interactive, and there's all of these things are going to merge, and they're all going to be one thing, which means that everybody needs to learn everything. I'm learning Unity. It's not, not the first thing I wanted to do this morning, get up and learn Unity, but, I'm doing it. And I just think that,
I'm happy you do.
What?
I'm happy you do.
Oh, yeah. But everything from video, I think that video is going to have interactive elements, and there's going to be a lot more, as this technology develops, there's going to be a lot more real video inside of interactive experiences that are fundamentally gaming type experiences. And I think that we're just going to, I just think that all these headsets are going to end up, until very recently, there was a pretty big distinction between a game made for the Rift and a game made for the HTC Vive because one was room scale and one was not. Now they're both room scale. That happened one night. So, I think
shipped out millions
exactly
just
in that night. And so we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
And from a creative perspective, this is right now currently kind of an issue.
Yeah.
I was just had a production meeting where we were talking about well, what is this experience? What are we going at from a creative aspect? And you've got a budget for almost top down. Okay, well, we're going to create this experience, and then we're going to render one for this, and then we're going to render one for this. And on the budgets that are actually being spent right now, this is a big cost that's taking away. I'll lose a day of shooting because I've got to have a couple of people creating this alternate experience for distribution. And especially when right now you've got an environment out there where people are like, well, the commercial will cost $1 million, but let's do the VR for 100,000 or for 50,000. And it's no, you need to add a zero onto traditional, not take away a zero.
I'm so glad.
So when you do that and then you add in oh, and by the way, we need an analogy would be we need an IMAX version, we need a traditional version, we need a Blu-ray, we need a DVD, we need a mobile, and those deliverables all cost something that comes right out of production design's budget, right out of days we can shoot, right out of what talents you can get.
I'm glad you're having those conversations. I want to have nothing to do with that.
And we have similar conversations, and I think the awareness that is the reality, that conversation needs to be had in the very first beginning, because if you run into those kind of decision makings along the way, then you're screwed.
Well, absolutely. It makes it really, you have to how are you being specific with this?
Yeah.
And to make good media, you have to be specific about what you're trying to say, tell, do, and that makes it really tricky.
But I think that also has to do with the kind of naivete of some of the VR clients that are out there. I bet all of us have walked into a room and someone's like, hey, I want it on VR. Mm-hmm. And there are like 40 or 50 follow-up questions that I would ask to that, and they have no idea that like they can't just get it in VR. And so I think, you know, you're going to start to see smarter clients and people that have done a VR project or two that have funded one that now understand a little bit more, but it's going to take a while. I mean, all of us have those conversations where it's like, okay, I want it in VR, and you're like, okay, mobile or HMD? And then the next question is, what is HMD?
Right. Well, then there's also just the first question, which is why? And, you know, you have to.
Just the most important
right,
question.
It's like, why VR? And, you know, and it's, you know, we've turned away clients because at a certain point you're like, we can do that better with traditional video. You know, why would you do, what is it that you're trying to achieve with this 360 experience? And, you know, it's just an honesty thing of saying, like, you know, I get that it's hot right now. That doesn't mean it's the thing to do. But if it is the thing to do, get over here. We want your money.
Right.
You know.
It leads into something I talk a lot about of adapting genres into virtual reality, which I think is a really, really cool and interesting question because some kind of content pieces work wonderfully in VR. I think they do even better than they would do on a 2D screen versus some flop. And the example that I like to use is I think doing comedy in virtual reality is extremely hard. It's really, really difficult, whereas horror, I think, is much easier than it is to do on 2D. And there are a lot of content producers and people funding content that I think are still figuring out those questions.
Absolutely. I mean, things like you're right on with comedy, and that's really why we haven't seen much of it yet. But in terms of just like, let's say, flat traditional 2D, like a movie, comedy is already the hardest genre to get right. You know, and so then you've got these other things going on, and I think it's a shame that nobody's tackled comedy because it could be fantastic. It's just hard.
And to your point, like if you want to create different forms of output, it's going to be even harder for guys like you to figure out during the production, well, maybe you have to do things 10 times over because you need to capture it differently to create different outputs later on in the process.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to think about how you
Absolutely.
do
You can't just put out an SD version and
Right.
have it do another color correction and you're done.
I mean, the amount of things that you kind of have to fundamentally change because now you've given the user control of looking adapts to every, you know, specific genre that's out there. You now have to redefine exactly how you tell a joke and how you do situational comedy.
Which also makes it really exciting. If anybody wants to tackle a comedy piece, give me a call because I think that's super exciting, you know, and I think there's absolutely a lot of room for that. But then, yeah, and that brings back all the same questions so that we're talking about, like, then how do you adapt it to this format, that format? And it can't just be one format at this stage.
And the first people to figure out that genre, it's just going to get replicated and replicated. It's one of those things where, you know, the first people to kind of figure out mechanics in VR, you can literally trace from years ago the first people who did kind of like teleport schemes and then see the next people who came and the next people who came and all that stuff kind of builds on each other. So the first people who kind of crack the code for like how comedy works, you're going to see that for years after.
And there's also going to be, you know, the thing that's already on the horizon that we already see happening is two more elements that's basically merging into VR because we talk as VR as one thing. So let's, for the purpose of this discussion, let's talk about the very high-end interactive experience. You build it on Unity. You know, you use cinematic level cameras to capture all the content in a super high resolution, 3D story, stereoscopic sometimes. You bring all of that together. There's cinematic storytelling. In my case, there's a musician that has a piece of content or a story to tell. All of that comes together in this new form of media. And now on top of that, we bring in avatars, like real lifelike avatars, with an element of artificial intelligence so you can actually interact with that avatar in real time. That's the conversation that's already going in some of the productions that we're talking about, that we have in the funnel. And then on top of it, we layer in where you can share and interact through social media on top of it. So all of these things, pieces of technology that individually exist or start to exist, are coming together in individual experiences.
Which I would also say it's kind of an essential part when you're talking about comedy and how hard it is. You know, you put on a headset, you're by yourself. I mean, how often do we say like, oh, I'm going to go watch a comedy, and you close the door to everybody else? You know, you want to have people with you. And I mean, the most recent thing we did with the Jimmy Kimmel experience of You're a Guest, it has some good laughs in it. It benefits from the fact that, first of all, you know, Jimmy Kimmel's looking right at you and interviewing you. And he's funny and charming, and you don't have to do much. He's going to be funny and charming. But it benefits from the fact that everybody in the room, when we see people watch it, they watch it in serial because they're like, oh, now I'm a guest. And everyone has the jaw-dropping moment of the audience standing up for them as they walk out, and they get the laugh. So everyone's laughing around them. They hear it. We encourage people to like have one earphone out so that everybody's hearing them laugh and they're laughing, because it works well. So there's that social aspect. I think when you get people into the headset, whether it be in a mixed reality way or not, if you hear people laughing with you, comedy's a lot better.
Yeah, and I think the reality, I think what we're not too far away from is that you could have 50 people with their own personal avatar, their lookalike avatar, or whoever you want to look like, literally sitting in that space, and everybody sees each other. And when you say something, you laugh, the other people know. It's like a replication of real life. Yep. Not necessarily sort of the Second Life kind of principle, but this is like where it's going to. And certain applications, particularly this could be really powerful.
Yeah. Even it's fairly simple. But if you are VR fans and you haven't thrown on the Facebook Spaces experience yet, which lets a video play around you while you're floating in space as an avatar, it's interesting to see how much that affects your view of VR in general. Right. Instantly seeing a social thing that works a little bit, even a little bit. No, I think it changes your perspective.
No, this is a really interesting area that comedy could go, and that's fascinating idea.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about partnerships, I got partnership on my mind. So the second level of partnerships, and we'll get to, hopefully, and we'll try to have the third level of partnerships I want to talk about is advertising and commerce and monetization. But before we do that, I wanted to get an idea from you guys. And you're all independent. You're not exclusive to any studio or entity like that. But I'd like to get an idea, even if you're not affiliated with Fox or Sony or Disney, what role they're playing now and what role you think they're playing in the future. Because I know right now there's not that much money in it, so they're like looking. But do you guys have a way to utilize their distribution platforms, and how you see their role in the future, because they have money and they have the advertiser relationships?
Yeah, I think those relationships are really important. We're focused on the music industry, yet we have relationships with all of the studios and their VR teams. And the reason is that they are very forward in creating very high-end experiences. They have their slates, they have the IP, and they have the money to invest and test and trial and create really epic stuff, just like the Alien thing. Amazing. And I really like to see them doing much more of that stuff, because they also push technology boundaries to figure out how to do things, to drive efficiencies, and the entire rest of the industry can live off of that. The other reason that we talk with them, actually, I was at Fox VR 2 days ago, is because we may use their production facilities, right? Some of them are building proprietary systems that are very valuable. That you need technology expertise and funding for, that not everybody can do. And they're open for the rest of the industry to use that. So it's a very collaborative market still, and I hope it's going to stay like that for a very, very long time. And in terms of partnerships, you mentioned their distribution. I don't look at any of the majors in any vertical in the entertainment industry for distribution, because they don't. They're notoriously bad at direct-to-consumer, at least for that part of the distribution. They have a multitude of other indirect distribution channels. They're actually looking at us for distribution.
Right.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, that's actually an interesting relationship. Yeah. Go ahead, BJ.
Well, I was just, it's kind of, in a way, it's a tangent, but I also think it's important when you say distribution channels and major production companies and major entities. I think it's important in this field not to forget.
Content aggregators.
Right. I would just say it's important not to forget about theme parks. I mean, what we think of as theme parks today are increasingly going to become AR, VR installations that
makes Disney very interesting.
Right.
Right, because they will take the theme park experience and then see how can I leverage that in the movie division and TV division and because that's it. That's where it's going to grow.
Right, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more smaller theme park ideas arising in this field that are going to be out there.
Caribbean VR,
right?
Is a no-brainer. And also the other entity that I hit whenever I go to shows that seems to be the most active is Discovery. They're doing a lot of stuff in-house, but they're making some really amazing VR experiences with dinosaurs and doing all the stuff they do.
I think the biggest thing the studios have is basically just intellectual property. They have brands and they have things that people want. And to go with what I said earlier, it solves the question of why should I get a VR headset? You know, if your 8-year-old kid wants a VR headset because How to Train Your Dragons is there, they're getting a VR headset. And like, you know, if I was head of a studio right now, I would really be working on creating a lot of shorter form intellectual property of my studio and have kind of like a smaller slate. We're talking, you know, VR experiences that are 20, 30 minutes right at kind of the consumer base and have a large list of those to get the platform holders to fund to then kind of create more and do more. I really think that the strategy for people who have lots of intellectual property is building a library. And I mean, that's in every different aspect. Like music, we were just talking about having all these different things that you could do. But I think when you have access to all these awesome high-level IPs, it's to build a VR library and then start to distribute that, because you're going to bring people to VR based on your intellectual property. And because you're going to do that, the platform holders are going to want to work with you and are going to pay for that. So you're actually doing revenue on kind of two separate streams. And I think that'll help grow the industry as well as grow the studio's monetization profit.
But I mean, but it's unfortunately the reality is they're not doing that.
Well, that's because no one can prove to them why they'll make money.
Right.
And that's like the key top question, is that when you get into a room is, why should I spend $3 million on VR when there are like less than that people with a high-end headset?
Exactly.
And so the model has to be proven before people are going to sink all this money. I mean, I did a market research thing last week that was looking at branded IP in HMD VR, and there are like 6 experiences, and we're not. And it's not necessarily genres that should even go to VR that are in there too. So there just isn't buy-in until someone can prove that the model works for them to drop millions of dollars.
And it's also expensive for them. They can't do a 5-minute piece for $200,000, because if I go and see that, I'm like, well, that's not Disney's quality, right? So what's going to happen probably to them is as this gets big enough that they have to do it, they have to spend $10 million on a piece. You know, whereas like we can do a piece for a couple $100,000 and have it be fantastic, because that's where the bar is right now, but they have that bind.
Yeah, I know, I completely agree. I think being strategic with those intellectual properties can be really helpful, especially in making sure that you don't have to spend those huge budgets. I mean, think of cartoons that could go to VR, and looking at the target market. Like, I would argue that Scooby-Doo would actually be a pretty cool VR IP to go into, and that's pretty much for all the segments of people that would do that. And I don't think you'd have to blow your budget to make like a 20-minute Scooby-Doo piece.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. All right, so we're actually getting through very quickly. Time is going, and I want to leave some time for audience in a minute. We're going to hit one more topic, and then we're going to go into audience. Whatever it is, audience questions. I wanted to get into advertising and find out how much involvement you are, directly with advertisers. Are you either doing sort of branded VR projects, or are you doing things that where do you see the place is right now? Because that's where money is. If you can provide value. Now, obviously, it's not traditional advertising where they need 20 or 30 million eyeballs, but this is something that engages a consumer, incredibly, and it creates a lot of buzz.
Yeah.
So I know you're doing some stuff directly with advertisers.
Right.
I think. So why don't you get started? Tell us.
Yeah, sure.
What you think.
I mean, there's room. I mean, there's room for every form of sort of funding coming out of brands and platforms, by the way, for that matter. The platforms have a little bit of a different interest and different requirements, if you will. When you look at advertising, I would like to split sponsoring from advertising, as in advertising more traditional, where there is an actual ad, as before, after the content, during the content, or something. That doesn't lend itself extremely well for sort of the high end of the market. But then we start more looking at product placement, which is a very well-known mechanism of getting sponsoring, or the powered by, supplied by, where one or multiple pieces are sponsored by a brand. So for that we work with the large digital agencies that have the connections to the big brands that we all know, that have the 6-7-figure budgets that we're looking for, and we have the let's say the artist brand names and user base that they are looking for. So that's a good trade-off. It also feeds into the monetization. So where we look at the whole portfolio of pieces of AR, VR content, easily that's 10 or 20 different pieces, like what we talked about before. We dissect those, and individual pieces are either have advertising, have sponsoring, or none of them, or are monetizable. And I think that's something that's very under-discussed still, is real monetization. I don't think, and I'm taking sort of the over-the-top view, that brands are not going to be paying for everything. Sometimes you hear like, oh, brands will pay for it, brands will pay for it. No, already now brands pay for the top 1%. I know you have a little bit of different experience there, but they don't pay for everything, right? And not everything in VR, even the smaller pieces are expensive enough that advertising doesn't necessarily pay for it. And somebody has to stream the heavy data as well. And if you set it off against advertising, if you do the math, you're obviously going to often end up in the red. So it doesn't always add up. On mobile, that's a different use case. But real monetization also sits in having a transactional model where consumers actually pay for content because they want to engage and immerse in the content with their artist that they love. And it needs to be something that they really value and that they really want to be part of, just like they go to a concert. And VR has that massive potential, or even more. So there is an actual real opportunity to monetize premium content on a transactional basis, and that is where a CFO, you talked about adding a zero. We have similar things where a music video commissioner comes to us, he's a marketing line item budget that says 50,000 for a music video, and now he adds music video in VR on a piece of paper, and he comes with $50,000. So, well, yeah, sorry, you have to go home and add a zero, and it means the CFO of the label now has to sign off, and he's going to ask, where's the money going to come from? So there needs to be a sensible case of this portfolio of content that includes a monetizable piece where there's actual transactions and there's at least recoupment to a large extent of that big expenditure.
I want to say two things on the topic. I take a content perspective for advertising, so I'm not necessarily exactly the person to, I think, talk best about this. But number one, in most of the advertising studies that I've seen, retention rate in virtual reality is 3 to 4 times higher than any kind of 2D or any other kind of ad. So there is that metric out there. At the same point, if you're going after advertising right now, the largest addressable market is mobile. So unfortunately, like a lot of these super high-end things that we can do for HMD, we just simply can't do for a cell phone. So I think it's kind of limited what the advertising market is there. And the last thing I'll kind of say is I think that there is a tremendous brand opportunity to use kind of that statistic that I said, 4 times retention rate, to actually transform your brand into something that people will remember. And the example that I always use is for Captain Morgan's, and that we see all these cool Captain Morgan commercials on television of the captain on top of a barrel. But if you could fight a sea monster with Captain Morgan, I guarantee you that anyone who played that when they go to the liquor store and see Captain Morgan will remember that experience. And I think that's the kind of thinking that's going to drive a lot of the cooler advertising experiences instead of kind of thinking about eyeballs.
Right, and then you can use your phone and use the camera to unlock an AR experience when you scan the bottle in a store.
And the tentacles come out and grab you.
The tentacles come out and grab you and say, buy me.
Yep. I'm there if anyone has some money.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to all of this is there's even a lower technological level in a sense where advertising dollars can get a lot of eyeballs, and that's simply in your Facebook feed. And this is fundamentally about 360 video, not interactivity at all, but it catches eyes. And this is simply because, I love VR. I think this is simply because it's new. People don't know what it is yet, but they want to drag around that circle. So you're going to get people to drag around that circle when it comes up in their thing. So you'll get, like we did a Banana Republic, drag around, see all of the summer dresses. And it got about 22 times their normal video hits just because people wanted to drag around that video.
You're right on with that. I mean, I found myself seeing friends I know in the industry will post something and I'm automatically going to try to drag, and it's like, no, this is not a 360 video, this is just like a cell phone video.
It's so magical.
I'm like, no.
It affects engagement with non-interactive video, apparently.
Absolutely.
Then you've bought hundreds of dollars worth of pants and they've got you.
Okay, good. Actually, you know what? It is time for our audience Q&A.
Cool.
So we have a person in the back. Let's say your name and company and ask your question.
Sure. Let me repeat the question. As I heard it, could you talk a little bit about the creative side and how you build VR experiences, in perspective versus like how you might do a short movie? I guess I'll just take it. It's all about environmental narrative for us. Mainly because we do a lot of horror. It's what is on the walls, what is on the floor, how should the player feel, instead of, in a script that you might read, the environmental narrative might be 3 lines. Like, we put lots of time and effort into what that looks like so that the player or whoever's doing the VR experience feels a specific way.
Yeah, and I think traditionally it's very an inside-out approach to the creative, right, where there is an idea, there is a treatment and a script, and that drives the execution. I think if you look now at creating VR, it's much more an outside-in perspective that complements it, where you have to think, what do I want the end user to walk away with? What do I want them to do? What do I want them to feel and think while they're in VR? And how does it translate into how I compose the experience? And then you have to work backwards basically and figure out how that original idea and that script and the treatment then is going to play out in this multidimensional, potentially interactive experience. So you have multiple angles that you need to discover and need to tie back together, if you will, which is way more complex than a traditional, much more linear approach to creating content.
And I think if I caught the part of your question right, was also like what types of stories, and I think it's the types of stories that like horror and things where it has lush environments. So one of the reasons why VR, it's like, well, because there's a lot to look at. Like I'm not personally a fan. I've seen a bunch of projects that have come out also that have been like black box, and to me that's interesting for about 30 seconds. Once I'm done checking out what's there, it's really interesting when I'm right in the beginning, but once I'm done with that, what else are we looking at? And so I think horror, different horror, sports, music, things that are multi-sensory really work extremely well.
I think it's actually an interesting observation about the black box theater aspect too, in the sense that I know where that comes from, and I think that there is an aspect to what works well in filmed VR that is, in an exotic location, in an incredible environment. The two things about VR are it's the grand ability to take you someplace you could never go, and then the ability to be intimate with people. And so the intimacy part of it does play in, and you do want to have, the experience you're going to have might be the kind of dialogue, if you have dialogue in something that you would find in a black box theater, but you better be on a space shuttle or
have it
somewhere
be really
interesting.
Specific and high quality. Like I produced a music video for a guy named Reap Swan, and it was all about ambisonic sound, and that was extremely interesting because we worked backwards from the beatboxing and the sound into the visuals. And so when you throw things up on its head like that, then you start to get these lush environments. So finding a story that's part of the reason for VR.
Right. And equally, you can think of something the complete opposite. If you would look at the Mill, they did a project, I think, to make Congress members understand what isolation means. So they shot a 360 film in an isolation cell. That is technically extremely simple, and the storyline is also very simple. But you can spend 20 minutes in an isolation cell and feel what it is to be in that enclosed environment. Something you could never do in 2D because you literally see a gray screen in front of you for 20 minutes. It doesn't make any sense. And you're going to do that for 2 seconds. In VR, all of a sudden, you can actually spend 20 minutes there and feel something.
And well, there may be nothing to look around in there, but then the point is
that
there's nothing to look around in there.
Point.
So whatever it is, having a point to it.
Yeah.
I do think, just to follow up with just advice on filmmaking and 360, I do think that what you'll find is that every really, really successful experience that people has, no matter what kind of film it is, in some way the person who walks out of it will explain, I did blank. It's an experience. I felt I did. Even if it feels third person, you'd still have the I was at a raid, where they were looking for illegal immigrants. I was there, and so there's something you have to keep in mind. Otherwise, people don't remember or feel like they could have seen it on 2D.
No, that makes sense. Hey, listen. First of all, this has been an amazing conversation. This is perfect. Actually, having 4 people was great. So I want to first of all thank you guys for this. This was your great, is an amazing conversation, and I want everybody here. Well, let's applaud. Let's do that first. Let's applaud. Give some acknowledgement.